Yeah, hi. So I wanted to talk with you about Microsoft Sentinel today and how to manage this at scale, not only like one Sentinel or two Sentinels, but maybe hundreds of Sentinels. And before we start, of course, big thank you to our sponsors who made this event possible, but of course also to you to join the session and also to join the conference. Without you, this wouldn't be possible either. Who am I? I'm Fabian Bader. I work as a cybersecurity architect at Glueckkanja, and I, on the one hand side, support our customers in deploying Sentinel, Microsoft Defender XDR, and other security solutions for Microsoft, but also do internal consulting for our managed CSOC. So we have an internal SOC that we offer to our customers, and many of those problems that we encountered, I want to share with you today. What to expect? So there will not be much coding today, so we don't see the shell. So it's slides, it's concept-based, but I still hope that many of you get a lot out of it. And of course, if you have any questions while I'm talking here, please just raise your hand and we will get the question. I try to repeat it. If I don't repeat it, throw stuff at me that I do it. And yeah, so who of you already manages Sentinel in your company? Okay, small amount. So I think most of you currently manage like one, maybe two Sentinels, or somebody with more than 10? More than 10? No? Okay. Then I hope still that many of those things that I will tell you are still applicable for you. But for everybody who's maybe not really aware what Sentinel is Microsoft's cloud-based SIEM. SIEM stands for Security Information and Event Management System. That means you can put in all the logs you have in there until your wallet is dry. And it's a completely, as I said, cloud-based solution, so you don't need anything on-prem other than the stuff that you need to send logs to Sentinel. It can detect threats in your environment, but if you just set it up and just put logs in, nothing will happen. So one of the most important things is it's not like XDR where you have something managed from Microsoft or other vendors. It's really you have to do the detection stuff. You as in, at least you have to deploy detections. There are free detections out there that you can use, but you are the one responsible for deploying them in there, making sure that everything is running as you like, and even create and write your own KQL queries to detect certain things. And this is exactly where the whole managing thing gets complicated when you start scaling up, because since we as an MSSP have not only like 5 Sentinels, we have over 100 Sentinel instances that we must manage. And of course, we want to make sure that analytic rules that get updated in every Sentinel. And also other configurations that we have centrally are pushed out to all of our customers to make sure that we have the protection that we expect at the customers, really at all customers. That means all the artifacts that we want to deploy, is it an analytic rule or a watch list, we must make sure that this is done by scale and that we can manage it without too much manual intervention on our end. And of course, as all managed service providers, you always try to have a standard that you can deploy. But you have customers, and customers are different, especially in the security space. So yes, you have maybe a lot of detections that work for everybody, but there are always detections that don't work in this environment, but are required in another. So now you might ask, okay, when you know Sentinel, you know there are a few options to do this. Why you don't just use the native stuff? There are actually 2 options. There's the Workspace Manager as well as native GitHub integration from Sentinel. And both have major downsides to them. For the Workspace Manager, as you can see, we can deploy analytic rules. That's perfect. So you have like an Sentinel that you only use to deploy stuff to other Sentinels. And you can build groups and everything. That's good. But if you want to do something like parsers or functions, that's really important when you have like firewall logs coming in and you want to like normalize the incoming syslog data. This you now have to deploy by hand or by other means. The same is true for Microsoft's own GitHub integration. This is also very limited in the artifacts that we can deploy. And in the end, all of those solutions have the problem. It's always more of a one-to-one in the workspace manager. Okay, maybe one-to-many-ish solution. But it's not like, okay, we have this central repository and then we can go customer by customer and deploy it there. So we decided, okay, we have to build something new. But if you want to build something new, it's always bad to go and build it completely from scratch because there's always stuff out there. So why not use that, what you already can use and what you have outside of your own company and look at that and build on top of this. And this is exactly what we did. We built lots of the scripting ourselves that are in between and actions and everything you will see. But we also have certain PowerShell modules and other stuff that we either use because they were there, or we say, okay, we built this and want to give back to the community because this is nothing super into our intellectual property. This is something everybody could use. Let's release it and also have the benefit. If more people are using it, you will get to edge cases that have problems. And if you solve them for everybody, that's good. So what we built is this. End of the talk. Have fun. No, just kidding. As you can see, it's quite the overview. But in the end, we have our customers on the right-hand side. And for each of the customers, we have a separate repository in GitHub. This means that we can have a version store that every change that we do on analytic rules and other artifacts is available for each customer. And we can also use GitHub functions like branch protection, pull requests, approval stuff in there to make sure that not one person can mess up all the customers at once. Because if you have something like this on scale and automation on scale, it's always important to make sure that it works. And that's also why we have stuff like update rings, and I will show more on that later. And then on the left-hand side, we have centrally managed points like, okay, we have our internal code base, we have external analytic rules, internal analytic rules, and of course we use stuff from the PowerShell gallery because we use modules there. Let's dive in on the customer side first, because even if you don't want to have all the other stuff, that is definitely interesting, even if you have just like 1 or 2 Sentinels. And what we have built there is that on the right-hand side, you can see we have different parts of the Microsoft Sentinel. So you have watch lists. Watch lists are, for everybody who's not used to the term, a log that is persistent within Sentinel. So you can like upload a CSV file and this will stay in the Sentinel forever if you don't delete it, other than regular logs that are removed after the log retention ended. So like after 90 days, maybe the logs are overwritten and they are no longer available. But maybe you have a list of people you want to contact. That is best put into a watch list, and then it's there until you update it or you remove it. The analytic rules, this is what actually makes the incidents, the alerts, that helps you to take benefit out of it. And then you have, of course, automations. Maybe you want to trigger a workflow if a certain incident happened, or even if an incident happened, because you might want to page your analysts that they look at that, because even if you only have one Sentinel, nobody wants to sit in front of it and refresh. And then at last, the parsers and functions. This is something within the underlying log analytics where you can define certain queries that you often use, like this syslog normalization stuff, and put it in like a PowerShell function and just call it. And all of this we have as deployment artifacts within the GitHub for the customer. Depending on what type of artifact, it either is a YAML, that's mostly for the analytic rules, or a CSV, that's mostly for the watch lists, or we have already JSON or ARM templates for other things like the automations, where there is no standardized way other than either Bicep or ARM, and we decided we don't want to do a whole lot of conversion. We already have to do that. Let's use ARM because it's not that difficult to understand for like automations. But you already can see we have conversion here. So this whole YAML thing that is also often shared in the internet for the analytic rules, you cannot just deploy it. You always have to convert it from YAML to ARM template and then deploy it. And the CSV, of course, is the same. You have the watch list, but to get a CSV in a watch list, you also have to create again an ARM template out of it and deploy it after that. And then we have the actual work done using GitHub Action workflows within the GitHub. And this gives us one big opportunity, and this is secret management. I don't know if you have been in the different sessions on secret management already today. I think Ben has one later on, I think one after me. And with this authentication using so-called federated credentials, we don't need any secrets that we manage. We have a so-called managed identity within the customer environment, and this is trusting this GitHub repo and just the main branch, meaning we can authenticate with a trust on the GitHub repo and don't have certificates that we must manage. We don't have any secret that we have to rotate or that we can lose. And that's really helpful, and I would recommend you to look into that using it. Yes, of course, please.
Yeah, quick question. GitHub Actions, great. Could I also use DevOps pipelines? Because that's possible.
Oh yeah, DevOps pipelines. So the question is, GitHub is great, but what if you use something else like DevOps? And yes, DevOps now supports, I think, like for 6 weeks now, also federated authentication, and you could use it there as well. So we have our artifacts in here. We know how to deploy them over, but how do we do all this conversion and this? For that, we use tools that are already out there, sometimes a bit modified. So Microsoft itself, for this GitHub integration, will deploy a GitHub workspace, a GitHub repo, and there's a Azure Sentinel deploy PS1 in there. If you look at it and you are more of the PowerShell scripting guy, as most of you should be, you will immediately close VS Code again and think, why they let do this somebody who is normally coding C or C#? Because that's how it looks. It's not the most easiest to read, and the function names are far from approved verbs or something. But okay, you can manage with it. We modified it in a few areas because they have certain change tracking in there that we don't need and that we removed. For the next thing, we have the Sentinel AR converter and the Sentinel enrichment modules, which I will talk a bit more on the next slides. And then also we have Pester in the mix. So what we do is we have a Pester definition on the minimum set of analytic rules and automations that we must have in any customer, and check if after each run, after each deployment, is this really existent in the Sentinel? So we just go out there, request everything using the management API from Azure, and compare it to what is defined in the repo. And if there's some analytic rule missing or a watch list not deployed, we can get feedback out of this. This is also available freely on GitHub. Then we have a bit of other stuff like SecureHeads has created a nice validation for analytic rules. So is everything in order? And we modified it a bit for us. And the last one is modules like AZ, PowerShell, YAML, because you don't want to create a new YAML conversion tool if there's already one out. Sentinel Enrichment is one of the modules that we share with the community. It allows you to create watch lists based on a CSV, and also has the ability to partially edit watch lists. So it's not only that you can just redeploy the watch list over, but you can also say, okay, deploy this watch list and look for changes that are maybe no longer in the existing watch list and remove only those. This is really helpful if you have stuff that is changing really often, like people, or it is also helpful because we use tags for something where maybe the customer is also editing this watch list, because we can use tags in the watch list to define what we deployed that we might also delete, but what the customer has created in there, we won't touch. You can also get information from like Graph or other sources, Azure Data Lake or Azure DevOps API, and put this data as a watch list in there. So one great example is that we read out all the service principals, application registrations, all this, including permissions, and put it as a watch list in Sentinel, helping us in our analytics rules, because this information is nowhere accessible. You only have like regular users, but not service principals. And service principals, as most of you know, if you are using Entra, have really, really broad permissions in many cases, and that's really helpful. And if we don't want to create a watch list, we can also put it in a data collection endpoint like a log in Sentinel. A question over there?
Is the reverse possible? I read out the customer's configuration and then send it to
Yes, that's also possible. So we don't back up everything from the customer, but certain states we also back up, like parsers and everything, just to have also a version history of that. If somebody is changing something there, we wouldn't redeploy it immediately, but we now can see, oh, somebody changed something that might be the issue that we now have. Another module that we have available, this is not officially from Glueckkanja, but that's a personal project of me, is the Sentinel AR converter. And that does exactly this. You take the YAML file, create an ARM file out of it, or the other way around. You go into your Sentinel, export your analytic rules as an ARM file, and then convert them to YAML and can share them on GitHub in a commonly used format. Over the time, we created additional features within this, so we can modify stuff like the start time of an analytic rule on the fly when we convert it to ARM, or we can change something like the severity, because maybe the original has like always high, but high might be a bit too aggressive in many cases. And what's completely new, and a blog post is coming out on this in the next week, is we can now do a parameterization. So we can have variables in the YAML file within the KQL code and replace this on the fly when we put it out to our customers. I just released the version last week. We internally use it already, and it's really helpful if you have something like break glass accounts or other stuff. And also there's a few validations and corrections in there for certain things that we know won't work if we just move it over. So it makes sure that even if the YAML file has something defined and it's not valid in the actual ARM schema, we correct it or remove it. For everybody who's not used to the whole ARM thing within Sentinel, you might ask why YAML, why this format and not just store it in ARM files. One reason is because many of the resources like the Azure Sentinel repository by Microsoft is using YAML, and that is why it is now like the de facto standard. And it's also much more readable for somebody who is not used to ARM, because if you are looking at an ARM template, of course it's the same data in there, but you have all this additional stuff like the concat on top and the API version that has nothing to do with anything other than how we want to deploy it. And for a security analyst, this is not really usable. A YAML file, also a learning curve, but a bit smaller one. So we use all those tools here to convert it, and then we use GitHub workflows to actually deploy these ARM files after that to the Sentinel workspace, protected by a federated credential, and the managed identity is the point of entry. That also gives the customer the opportunity, if they want to just disable this sync, they can just disable the managed identity, and that's done for. For the whole pipeline down here, we use not code within the customer repository, but we have completely branched this out into so-called GitHub Actions in a centralized GitHub repository. And why we do this, it's make it so much easier to have a common code base for all the customers. So we don't have to be like, oh, we now updated this PowerShell script. Let's update all the repositories in all the customers. It makes it super reusable because we can use one workflow in all the customers and just reference to this central point. And we can also scope based on branches and have an easy solution to have something like update rings. More on that a bit later. And another thing is we can now also use code owners within GitHub. This is a feature in GitHub where you can define who is responsible for which parts within the repo. And that makes it possible to say, okay, the analyst can change maybe the analytic rule, but they can't change the actual PowerShell deployment configuration. So you have a separation of duty here. And this really helps to minimize errors on human end. So how this looks, so on the right-hand side on the customer repository, we just define, okay, we have our CSOC Foundation in the CSOC Foundation code base, and we want to deploy Sentinel artifacts. And as you can see here, in my case, in my repo, I have a dev branch where I develop in. For a regular customer, there would be like the stable branch in there. And then there's a few information that I have to provide, like, okay, client ID, all those information for authenticating. And on the other hand, on the internal code base side, I now have the actual code. So there I can call the PowerShell and everything. But this is just the reference, so the customer references, or the customer repo references this repo, and we have this central point of update that really makes it easy. I already mentioned that we also use these update rings. So we have stable, insider, and def. Def is more like, as you have seen, it's not always called def, but def depending on who is developing. And now I can just configure in the customer repository through a variable, okay, which one do you want to use? And that way I can also have real good testing, because maybe I have a new feature I want to deploy. You put it first in Insider, so if you like a few customers who are in there, or even internal Sentinels in there that get this, and after a week of testing you can say, okay, this worked out perfectly, let's put it in the stable ring, the stable branch, and after that all the customers that are scoped for that will get the update. So if you do something like this, I would highly recommend establishing at least some kind of testing there. Even if you have just one Sentinel, maybe have a second one just to test your deployments there before you do it in the production one. You don't have to put in much data there, so there is no big cost associated to it. Now we have the 3 steps. We have the customer, we have the repository of the customer, and our internal code base. And if we move back to the overview, you can see we now covered most of this. What I not mentioned yet is how we do security. Currently with the PowerShell gallery, there's only one method how we can ensure that the module we are using is not manipulated, and this is version pinning. So all of our modules that we are using are version pinned to a certain degree, and then we do code reviews when we update to other versions. Of course, sometimes it's not completely open source, so there's some trust you have to have in the provider. But still, I also would recommend, especially if you do this for more than one company, to ensure that you're not just taking what the module is providing as the next version. It could be bad code that's coming downstream. If you have seen the session yesterday on the new Azure Container Registry and get provider, I think that will be something in the future where we might go for an internal repository then and even have more control over this, and also publish our own internal modules that we don't want to put on the gallery. But there's one part missing on the left, and that is the actual detections. So we now have the ability to put all this to the customer, but there is nothing in there yet. And how we do this is that we have two sources. The one is a completely internal analytic rule code base, where we have self-written analytic rules, all that stuff, and also something called a metadata store. And then we have the external analytic rules, where we get from public repositories the analytic rules, like the Azure Sentinel, or my repo is in there, and other people that are sharing with us their analytic rules. And of course, we not just take this as granted and just put it in here with each update. Again, we have a workflow. A pull request is created for each update that is coming in. We review it before we then put it in our internal repo before we deploy it to the customer to make sure, okay, this update is really something that we want at our customers. And if we have a look here, how this works after we want to deploy something, there's two options. So one is we have a detection CSV. This is something where the customer, and not the customer, the analyst or the responsible for this customer can put in like the GUID from such an analytic rule. And if it's in there, it will be grabbed from one of those repositories and deployed to the customer. And the other thing is that we have a detection metadata store where we have made decisions on those are identity rules. And those are identity rules we want to have at every customer. And while we deploy everything, we also look in this metadata store and see, oh, okay, this is the list of 20, 30 analytic rules that should always be deployed, regardless if they are in the detection CSV or not. And this gives you also a good opportunity to scale, because if you have to manage a CSV per customer, then there's also configuration drift, and you don't want to have that. And this way you have an opportunity to have a central place to also say this analytic rule must be at every customer because it's super important. But as I said, there's always the issue of, yes, this analytic rule is really great, but it's different from each customer. So one super example is something like the break class account. So everybody might know what that is. That is the account in Entra you should have that is excluded from all the conditional access policies, from MFA, from everything. That is only used if there's an emergency and you cannot log in anymore. And this account, of course, is not the same in every environment. We couldn't go to our customers and say, you have to name it emergency 1. And then they would say, no. So one option here would be to have a analytic rule per customer, or to create a watch list where you have the emergency accounts in there. But with watch list, there's one problem. You can't use so-called near real-time analytic rules. So You could go down to something like 15-minute checks, but it would be really cool to have this incident immediately created if somebody is using it and not 15 minutes after the fact. And this is where we now have the option to parameterize. So we have our analytic rule that is always the same, but the user object ID, this is just a variable. And this we can define per customer, and it will be overwritten in the moment we deploy it as an ARM template. We also have the ability to change the runtime. In the do's and don'ts sections, I will tell you why this is important. And other stuff is we can also append or prepend the KQL query. This can also be helpful if you say, yes, this analytical is great, but I must have some option to filter out certain accounts or certain actions at the end, like an allow list. And this gives you the option to keep the original format, but just append a few lines at the end. And this is how this looks. So we have our external rules, we have our internal rules, and then we have so-called param YAMLs that contain the overwritten part. For external rules, we can do this globally. And for external and internal rules, we can also do it on a customer basis. And this gives us the opportunity to have like internal rules with variables and external rules where we want to change maybe severity or certain other things within this analytic rule. And this brings me to the do's and don'ts. One really not so optimal thing, and Microsoft has recognized that in the meantime, is analytic rules normally run the minute you deploy them. So if you have something like your customers 50 Sentinels and you deploy all the rules at the same time, then all your analysts get some alert at the same time. And if it's something that is run every day and maybe is creating an informational alert for there's no log data coming in and something is wrong maybe with this query, now your analysts are really mad at you because they have hundreds of tickets at the same time. This is why we have the ability to define a start running at in the moment we deploy it to the customer. And what we do is we create a custom run starting time based on the repo name. And it's always between 9 in the morning and 2 in the afternoon. And based on hashing, it's always the same time. But for each customer, it's a bit different. Another thing is when you start to back up certain things from Azure, the sorting of the return object is really messed up. And you don't have the option to say to Azure, give it in an ordered way. So something like the invoke sorter JSON object that will sort it just by property name is really helpful, because otherwise your GitHub commit look like this, because each day you have changes, but it has not really changed. It's just line 5 is now line 10. And yeah, and as you can see, after we introduced that, it's much quieter in the repository. Still changes, but then only those that you really want in there. I also can only highly recommend to think about what are the analytic rules that you want to have in all of your Sentinels. So create some sort of meta store where you have information. Is this analytic rule suitable? Especially if you are using stuff from outside. So if you say, okay, Azure repository looks good, make sure that the analytic rules that you get there bring you value and are really actionable in your environment. And also have metadata information in your automation. So use this when you deploy to maybe automatically deploy the same stuff in different Sentinels. One last thing is get telemetry. So we are using the Sentinel Pester framework to get back, has the deployment worked? Is everything in order like we wanted? Is configuration in Sentinel the same over all the customers, at least for the important settings? Get information about how your incidents are performing, because just because you have decided this analytic rule is good, doesn't mean that your analysts and the false positive rate agrees with that. So get information about that, and also always listen to your analysts, get feedback from them. They are working with the end result, and if something is not working, they are the first to know. So based on this, we now have a comparison slide that it looks perfect. Everything is green on the left-hand side. Might be biased here. So now you have created all this. You can now deploy to hundreds of Sentinels in an automated way. Are you done? Is this the end? No. So if you want to do something more, there is more to do, because as I said, you have to maybe have some automation that can handle the incidents that are created. You have to have something like information sent to your analysts in the moment something happens. Or also you have to have some reporting that comes back from this information that you created in Sentinel. And all of this you can do greatly with PowerShell. Yes, please. Yes, this is what we use for the Sentinel Pest framework for. So we have defined a certain set of rules as well as dynamic. So we check, are all the ARM templates that we want to deploy really deployed? Are all the analytic rules deployed? And also, are they in the correct state? So if they exist, are they enabled? Are certain versions the version that we have in the repository? All that stuff. And yeah, the Pester framework for that is also available on GitHub, so you can check that out. And it's highly customizable for your environment. And even if you have just one Sentinel, it makes totally sense to deploy this. Even if you just want to be like, okay, is UEBA enabled, or is another log analytics value set, like, do we have 180 days log retention, or somebody messed up with that and changed it to 5 days. So this would be the end from my end. I hope you got some good things out of that. And if you have questions, please feel free to ask. Thank you. No questions yet. You will find me also outside and over the next few days. And yeah, so come up to me if you have anything that I didn't cover. And if you want to have a short demonstration on how the parameterization works, come up. We can sit down and just do a quick demo there. Maybe I will do a community demo over the next few days on that as well. Yeah, let me know. Thank you very much.